my topic is making language acquisition happen. You know, when Pamela invited me to talk, I thought, well, I could do, you know, online language acquisition. I could do hybrid classes. I could do, you know, just talking about sort of the theory behind it all. But then I thought, I think what most people would be interested in is just the concept of language acquisition itself. So I'm kind of trying to do this head-on in a way to make it more interesting, but in a way also to make it more controversial, so that you know, you can look at the thing head-on. But having said that, I'm also going to borrow from the early scholastics methods. The pseudo-Dionysius uses the apophatic theology to get at you know, what God is. So I'm not going to be talking about God, but I'm going to be starting at least by talking about what language acquisition is by means of what it is not. Right? So negative theology. So, okay. Okay, so how does language acquisition happen? Most of us have textbooks. If you learned another language outside of the one that you spoke as a first language, if you learned the language institutionally, you probably use a textbook. So textbooks, we have to assume that the authors have spent quite a bit of time trying to determine an ideal order in which language ought to be learned. So that order, usually, although there are exceptions, usually begins with a present tense. And then they will add a future tense somewhere down the road. By 102, we get to those notorious past tenses, and we sprinkle in adverbs and all kinds of things all the way through. But I think we can question the order in which language is learned. And I think we should question the order in which language is learned. So whether or not that textbook order is ideal is something that we are going to be talking about. And I will get to that later in the talk, but for the moment, I would really, I'm just going to be offering some general assumptions about language acquisition that I hope, in some ways to debunk for you. All right, so let's see if I can figure out. So the second question is, how do we know it's happening? And this, of course, involves keep you on your toes. Assessment. Yes, thank you very much. Because we really don't know if it's happening unless we assess. And I have given workshops on assessments, and they're usually like 8 hours in length, so I'm not going to be doing that. But I may be getting just sort of to the tip of the iceberg on assessments. All right, so there are some problematical equations in the whole sense of language acquisition, or as I indicated on the flyer, dissonances. And the first one is teaching equals learning. So this is not exclusive to language. This is across the board. And the assumption here is that if we explain something really well, students will get it, learn it. And if they don't, what's the problem? Them. Right. They're lazy, or maybe they're just idiots, or maybe the explanation wasn't as good as it could have been. So what do? We don't sleep that night, but in addition to that, we spend a lot of time improving our explanation. Right? We bring in more visuals, we underline things, emphasize things, take out any peripheral things that might have been confusing, bend over backwards, basically, to improve the explanations. The problem with the notion is that is the basic assumption that explanations actually lead to learning, and they seldom do. That's the problem. Okay, so some of you might be familiar with this little cartoon. Can everybody read it? Yeah, is it big enough? So it's the two boys and the dog. I taught Stripe how to whistle. I don't hear him whistling. I said I taught him. I didn't say he learned it. Right? So I can imagine that the boys' whistling demonstration and explanation was probably pretty good. You know, it simply means that you can consider yourself an excellent teacher. But if your students aren't succeeding, then you have to ask yourself some important questions. Maybe, you know, not just asking these questions of your students or your dogs, but also of your teaching methods. Okay? So I really do think that not everybody quite understands the concept that teaching does not equal learning. I really think it's a radical sort of disconnect or dissonance that's really hard to wrap your head around. Okay? Almost as radical as the Copernican revolution. You know, it's the whole sense that, oh, you mean the universe doesn't revolve around earthlings? Oh, you mean the classroom doesn't revolve around the teacher? It's a disconnect. It's a major shift in perspective. Research has shown that in a typical classroom, 70% is teacher talk. So, I mean, if you look at that whole sort of geocentric universe, ours tends to be a very teacher-centric universe. And we tend to be okay with that. And why is that? Because of the Atlas. So who is Atlas? Teacher. All of us. Anybody know, who Atlas was? Why we use Bardo Atlas? A Greek god. We are all gods, are we not, as teachers? You sometimes consider yourself as God because we stand up here and impart divine information to our students who then gobble it up. And it tends to be a pretty satisfactory equation simply because the onus is on you as a teacher, right? You are the one who's bearing the world on your shoulders, who tends to take all of the responsibility. So the emphasis is definitely and distinctly on teaching as opposed to learning. And the students who are sitting there looking at you, either wide-eyed or with their eyes closed, really don't want the emphasis shifted onto them. So they prefer it that way. So just because the equation works in your classroom and everybody seems to be very happy doesn't mean that it's a productive classroom, right? So I'm here also sort of to debunk this Atlas complex and to hopefully degrade us as teachers, since all of us here are teachers, in fact, to a different kind of status. You are gods in your own right, just not in this one. Okay, the other problematical equation is that achievement equals proficiency. And let's first just define these terms. What is achievement? Does anybody know, as opposed to proficiency?
Is it learning the things that were taught? In other words,
yes.
Picking up, doing well on the tests.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there are differences in tests, because you can have a proficiency test and an achievement test. But yes, in the sense of discrete pieces of information, we would call grammar structures, vocabulary items, that sort of thing. So it's learning and demonstrating a discrete skill, essentially. And those discrete skills might be verb conjugation, noun declension, adjective agreement, right? All of those things, okay? And how, in fact, are students going to demonstrate this?